My name is Harold Sutton. I'm 63 years old, and I've spent the last 31 years of my life working as a senior auditor for the IRS field office in Columbus, Ohio. I know what fraud looks like. I know what it smells like. I've sat across the table from people who thought they were smarter than everyone in the room, and I'd watched their faces change the moment they realized they weren't. I'm telling you this not to brag. I'm telling you this because it matters. It matters a lot, actually, for everything that comes after. My wife Carol passed away 4 years ago, pancreatic cancer. 6 weeks from diagnosis to the end. We didn't even have time to be scared before it was over. We'd been married 37 years, raised one son together, our boy Danny, and built a life on 40 acres outside of Marysville that Carol's family had owned since the 1940s. The farmhouse needed work when we got it, but we fixed it up over the years. New roof, new kitchen, wraparound porch. Carol always wanted. It wasn't a mansion, but it was ours and it was paid for, and it was the kind of place where you could sit on that porch in the evening and feel like the world made sense. After Carol passed, Danny was the one who showed up every weekend for the first year. Every Saturday morning, without fail. We'd work on whatever needed doing. Fence line, tractor maintenance, the old barn roof that had been threatening to give for a decade. We'd eat lunch at the kitchen table where he'd eaten every meal of his childhood. He'd stay until dinner, sometimes longer. I won't pretend I wasn't lonely. I was, deeply. But Danny being there made it bearable. Then he met Kristen. She came into his life about 18 months after Carol died. He met her at some networking event in Columbus. She worked as a paralegal at a civil litigation firm downtown, sharp as a tack, dressed like she'd just stepped out of a magazine. Danny was smitten inside of 2 weeks. I could see it. That particular kind of glow a man gets when he thinks he's found something rare. I tried to like her. I genuinely did. She was polite enough at first, pleasant even, and clearly intelligent. But there was something about the way she looked around my house when she first visited that I filed away without really examining. Not the look of someone taking in a home. The look of someone taking an inventory. Danny proposed to her about 8 months in. They got engaged on a Tuesday. He called me from his car, almost crying, and I was happy for him, truly. Whatever I'd filed away about Kristen, I put it aside. He was my son, and he was happy. And sometimes that has to be enough. The wedding was set for the following May. Small ceremony. About 80 people. A venue outside of Dublin. Nice affair. I wore Carol's favorite tie, navy blue with small white dots, because I knew she would have wanted to be there somehow. I danced exactly once with my sister-in-law, and I stood at the back of the room for most of the reception watching my son look at his new wife like she was the answer to something he'd been asking for years. I drove home that night feeling the particular loneliness of a parent who has successfully let go. 3 weeks later, my daughter-in-law came to my house with a document she said I needed to sign. She called ahead, which I thought was considerate. Said she wanted to come by on a Saturday morning to go over some paperwork, her exact words. I asked if Danny was coming. She said he was busy with a work thing, but that this was pretty routine, just some estate planning documents that their attorney had prepared. I said, fine, come at 10. She arrived at 10 past, dressed casually, carrying a leather portfolio. She sat at my kitchen table, Carol's kitchen table, and opened the portfolio with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this before, which, as a paralegal, she had. Harold, she said. She'd never called me Dad, which I noticed but never said. Now that Danny and I are married, we've been thinking about the future, about the property, and we just want to make sure everything is set up correctly in case something happens to you. I looked at the document she slid across the table. It was a deed transfer, quitclaim deed, transferring my 40 acres and the farmhouse from my name into joint ownership with Danny and Kristen. I picked it up, read the first 2 paragraphs the way I'd read 10,000 financial documents in 31 years. Then I set it down, folded my hands on the table, and looked at her. Where's the attorney's bar number on this? I asked. She blinked. It should be at the bottom. It's not. I turned the page toward her and pointed to the signature block. There's a name, but no bar number, no firm address, no notary seal on the acknowledgement page. She smiled the way people smile when they're recalibrating. It probably just needs to be notarized. We can do that step after. I set the document back down. And you said Danny knows about this? Of course, we discussed it together. I'll give him a call then, just to confirm. Her smile stayed exactly where it was, which told me everything. He's really hard to reach today, Harold. Like I said, work thing. We can loop him in later. I stood up, walked to the counter, poured myself a second cup of coffee, and said, "You know what? Let me read through the whole thing carefully before I sign anything. I'm slow with legal documents." I smiled at her. Occupational habit. She left 20 minutes later with the document unsigned. I stood at the front window and watched her car back out of the driveway, and I thought about that look she'd given my house the first time she'd walked through it. And then I thought about something I hadn't let myself think about before. I went to my desk and I called my son. He picked up on the second ring. Not hard to reach at all. "Hey, Dad, what's up? Did you send Kristen over here with a quitclaim deed to transfer the farm into her name?" A long pause, longer than it should have been. It's both our names, Dad. It's just estate planning. It's simpler that way," Kristen said. "So there's no probate, Danny." I kept my voice level. I'd kept my voice level for 3 decades talking to people who were lying to me. "This property belonged to your mother's family. Your grandmother was born in that house. Your mother is buried 2 miles from that porch. Do you understand what you're asking me to sign?" Another pause. Shorter this time, but different in quality. "She said you'd be difficult about it." I didn't say anything for a moment. "She's probably right," I said finally. "I'll talk to you soon, son." I hung up and sat at Carol's table for a long time. I want to be honest with you about what the next few days were like, because I think people gloss over this part and it matters. I wasn't angry, not at first. I was something worse than angry. I was that particular kind of sad that comes when you understand that someone you love has been replaced, at least partly, by someone else's version of them. Danny was my boy. He had Carol's eyes, and her stubbornness, and her way of laughing at his own jokes, before he finished telling them, and he was sitting somewhere in Columbus genuinely believing that having his wife pressure his widowed father into signing over his home was reasonable behavior. That's not anger. That's grief wearing a different coat. But I'm an auditor. I don't stay in grief. I move to documentation. The first call I made was to my attorney, a man named Gene Polaris, who'd handled Carol's estate and who I trusted completely. I told him what had happened, and emailed him a photo of the deed document Kristen had left behind. She'd forgotten it, or possibly left it intentionally, as another form of pressure. Gene called me back within the hour. He confirmed what I already knew. The document was improperly executed, but more importantly, the intent behind it was potentially actionable, especially if Kristen had prepared or sourced the document through her law firm without client authorization. "Harold," he said, "don't sign anything. Don't discuss this further with Danny or Kristen without me on the line. And I want you to do something before our next conversation." "What's that?" "I want you to write down every conversation you've had with Kristen about this property. Dates, times, what was said in as much detail as you can remember." I told him I already had. I'd started the list while we were talking. Over the next 3 weeks I did something that I should probably explain because it might sound cold-blooded. I continued behaving normally. I called Danny on Sundays the way I always had. I was polite when Kristen answered. I accepted their invitation to dinner once, sat at their kitchen table in their Columbus condo, ate the pasta Kristen made, and listened to them talk about potentially helping me downsize at some point in the next year or two because the farm was a lot for one person to manage. I said maybe you're right and asked for seconds on the pasta. What I was doing underneath all of that normalcy was building a record. I contacted the Ohio State Bar Association and filed a formal inquiry regarding the document Kristen had presented to me, specifically whether it had been prepared using resources from her firm, which would constitute unauthorized practice on behalf of an undisclosed party. I gave them the document photo and everything I knew about the firm she worked for. I also, with Gene's guidance, met with an estate planning attorney, and established an irrevocable trust, the Sutton Family Trust, created in accordance with Ohio Revised Code. The farm went into that trust. My right to live on the property for the remainder of my life was explicitly preserved. The beneficiary upon my death was a charitable agricultural foundation that Carol had loved, not Danny and not Kristen, not because I wanted to punish my son, but because I needed the asset protected from any future attempt to transfer or encumber it, regardless of what document someone might try to get me to sign. I want to be very clear. I didn't do any of this out of malice. I did it because I am a man who spent 3 decades watching people convince themselves that their small frauds were harmless, that the person they were taking from could afford it, that the technicalities would never catch up to them. They always do. The technicalities would never catch up to them. They always do. The technicalities always catch up. 4 weeks after the dinner party, Kristen called me on a Thursday evening. Danny was on the call too, though he barely spoke. She said they'd been talking and they felt I really should consider the practical realities of estate transfer and that a quitclaim deed was the most straightforward option. She said the attorney they'd been working with, and this time she named him, a man named Gerald Foss, a solo practitioner in Westerville, had assured them everything was standard. I had been recording the calls since the first ring, as Ohio is a one-party consent state. I let her talk. She talked for about 8 minutes. She mentioned the property value twice. She mentioned that without proper transfer, there could be complications in my care arrangements as I got older. And she paused, deliberately, after that phrase, the way you pause when you want someone to understand a threat, without having said one. I said, "Kristen, let me ask you something. Has Mr. Foss seen a copy of the Sutton Family Trust documentation?" Silence. "Because he should," I said. "Jean Polaris filed it with the county recorder's office 3 weeks ago. The property's not mine to sign over. It belongs to the trust now." The silence lasted long enough that I counted to 7 in my head. "What trust?" she said. "The irrevocable trust I established in March," I said pleasantly. "I'm actually surprised Gerald didn't catch it when he ran the title. That's generally step 1 when you're advising clients on a property transfer." I heard her breathing change. "I also want you to know," I continued, "that the Ohio State Bar received a formal inquiry 3 weeks ago regarding the document you brought to my house in April. And I want you to know that I have this conversation recorded, along with the previous one, where you suggested there might be complications in my care arrangements." I paused. "I know what a threat sounds like, Kristen. I've been doing this for 31 years. The call ended about 40 seconds later. What happened over the following 6 weeks was, to borrow a phrase, a series of consequences. The bar inquiry triggered a review at Kristen's firm. It turned out the original deed document, the improperly executed one she brought to my house, had been drafted using firm resources on firm time without any client engagement on record. That's a serious thing. That's the kind of thing that ends careers. Jean also referred the recorded call to a colleague who specialized in elder financial abuse. Ohio has specific statutes on this. The reference to my care arrangements in the context of a property transfer discussion constituted under Ohio Revised Code 2913.02, a pattern consistent with attempted financial exploitation of an older adult. I'm 63, which technically qualifies. The colleague filed a complaint with the county prosecutor's office. The part of this story that I find hardest to tell is what happened with Danny. He called me about 2 weeks after the Thursday call. Not on a Sunday, his usual day. A Wednesday night, around 9. He sounded like he hadn't slept in a few days, which he probably hadn't. "Dad," he said, "I didn't know about the recording. I didn't know about the bar thing. I believed him. I still believe him. Danny is many things, but he is not subtle enough to have hidden all of that from me." "I know," I said. "She told me it was just estate planning. She told me it was better for you, simpler, that you wouldn't have to worry about probate or Danny." I stopped him gently. "I know. I keep thinking about Mum," he said. "About how that's where Mum is. How her mum is. How her mum is. How her whole family—" His voice broke and he stopped talking for a moment. I sat there and let him have that. I didn't really think about what I was doing. She said it was the right thing to do, and I trusted her, and I didn't think it through. There are things you can say to your child in a moment like that, and there are things you shouldn't. I have had 37 years of practice in choosing which is which. Carol was much better at it than me, but I've learned. You come out Saturday, I said. We'll fix that section of fence on the east pasture that's been down since February. I'll make the chili Carol used to make. I finally found her recipe card in the back of the index box. He came Saturday. We fixed the fence. We ate chili. We didn't talk about Kristen much, and when we did, it was briefly and honestly, and without me saying anything I'd need to take back later. As for Kristen herself, she resigned from the law firm before the bar inquiry concluded. The firm, for their part, was cooperative with the investigation, which is generally what firms do when the alternative is worse. The elder financial abuse complaint resulted in a formal caution rather than prosecution, which I'll be honest about. I was somewhat hoping for more. But Jean told me that the caution would follow her professionally, which in the legal field is its own form of consequence. The divorce filing came about 3 months after the Thursday phone call. Danny moved back to Columbus, a different apartment. He's been out to the farm a lot this summer, more than before, actually. Last Saturday we poured a new section of concrete in the barn. The old floor had been cracking for years, and we worked side by side for most of the afternoon without saying much beyond what needed to be said about the work. At some point around 4 o'clock, Danny straightened up and looked out the barn door at the property, at the fields and the old oak line and the roof of the farmhouse in the middle distance, and he said, "This place looks the same as when I was a kid." "That's the idea," I said. "Mom would have hated that crack in the barn floor. She absolutely would have, mentioned it every winter since 2018. He laughed. That particular laugh he has where he starts before the joke is finished. I want to say something to anyone watching this who might be in a situation that sounds familiar. I'm not a dramatic person. I've never been the kind of man who makes speeches or turns events into lessons. But I've watched a lot of people over the years make the mistake of thinking that a document is just a document, that a signature is just ink, that property is just property. It isn't. It is 40 years of a family's mornings and hard winters, and the specific smell of a kitchen where someone you loved used to cook. It is the place where your wife is still present in every corner because she chose every corner. It is not interchangeable. It is not transferable. And if someone sits across from you at the table that belonged to your mother and slides a document toward you and calls it routine, read it slowly. Read it like someone who has been lied to before. Read it like someone who knows that the word routine is most dangerous when used to describe something that is anything but. The farm is still mine. More precisely, it belongs to the Sutton Family Trust, which means it belongs to something larger than me and safer than a signature. It belongs to the memory of the people who built it and, eventually, to the land itself. Carol would have liked that, I think. She always said the land remembers everything. I've spent enough time on this property now to believe she was right. I've thought a lot about why Kristen thought it would work. Not in a bitter way, more the way you turn a problem over after it's already been solved, just to understand the mechanics. She saw a 63-year-old widower living alone on 40 acres. She saw a son who trusted her completely. She saw paperwork, and she saw someone she assumed wouldn't read it carefully. What she didn't see, couldn't see, because she never bothered to look, was who I actually was. That's the thing about people who operate this way. They do their research on the asset. They never do their research on the person. I don't think Kristen was born calculating. I think she made a series of small choices over time that each felt manageable, each felt justified, until one day she was sitting at a dead woman's kitchen table, sliding a fraudulent deed across the surface and calling it estate planning. That's how it usually works. Nobody wakes up one morning and decides to become the kind of person who exploits a grieving father. They just keep making the next small choice and the next, and somewhere along the line they lose the ability to see what they've become. Danny made small choices too, different ones, but still. He chose to let someone else do his thinking for him. He chose comfort over clarity. I've been a father long enough to know that you can raise a child with every good value you possess, and still watch them drift when the right person applies the right pressure at the right moment. That's not a failure of parenting. That's just being human. The measure isn't whether you drift, it's whether you find your way back. He found his way back. That matters more to me than anything else in this story. What I keep coming back to when I think about all of it is this. The farm survived because I had spent 31 years learning to think slowly, not hesitantly, slowly. There's a difference. Hesitation is fear wearing the mask of caution. Thinking slowly is the deliberate refusal to let urgency override judgment. Every time someone put a document in front of me and said, "This is routine," I had been trained by work, by experience, by Carol's particular brand of wisdom, to stop and ask what routine was being used to cover. That instinct is worth more than any property. Here's what I'd tell anyone watching this who recognizes something in what I've described. You don't need 30 years of auditing to protect yourself. You need one thing: the willingness to read what's in front of you, even when someone is sitting across the table radiating impatience. Especially then. The pressure to sign quickly is almost always the most important signal in the room. Legitimate transactions can survive a slow reader. The farm is still there. Danny was there last Saturday. We poured concrete in the barn, the way men do when they're rebuilding something that isn't the barn. Carol's recipe cards are still in the kitchen drawer. The east pasture fence holds. Some things, if you're careful enough and clear-eyed enough, you get to keep.